Yep, there we go. Got my message. We're recording. All right. So thanks everyone for showing up to this latest installment of our Azure Intelligent Edge brief. My name's Kevin Sullivan. I'm a global black belt specialist on the Intelligent Edge team. And so with me today with our focus area, who I'll introduce here in a minute, is Mr. Matt McSpirit. He's one of my teammates, and he will be running most of the focus area talk today. I'm speaking about this wonderful utility and tool that he has maintained and developed and keeps getting better and better known. Currently, I believe, Matt, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the ASDK Configurator tool.
Yeah, you're wrong.
Oh, I'm wrong? Okay.
No,
See, I'm already off to a bad start, which is completely fine. So the agenda is very simple. We'll just give a quick overview, just some of the, for folks that are new to this call, just spend a few minutes there, but we'll spend the majority of this half hour with Matt focused on what good things he has. And so he'll already got the wrong title, but essentially the tool has something to do with configuration of this thing called Azure Stack, and today specifically the ASDK. So we'll have Matt explain that when we get to him. Before that, just a couple of disclaimers and what this call is. So again, it's a 30-minute brief. We can't really share NDA information because I open this call to anyone and everyone on the planet that wishes to join. So therefore, we're not really in a position where we can divulge NDA information. So if you ask questions, we might have to politely divert if there are things that we just can't talk about in this open forum. We are using regular teams, so I appreciate, and everybody's been very good so far about keeping their mute on and everything else. And, given the crowd, depending on where we go with folks that come in and all that good stuff, I'm okay if you want to ask an audio question, but essentially just be polite. We're all on teams and we all have the same amount of access to make this a horrible call. So just be cognizant of your mute and everything else. These calls will be recorded and it's embedded in the invite. I've got an AKS link for AIEB-channel if you wish to look at this recording as well as some of the past recordings we've had. And then, of course, the future ones will be recorded as well and will appear at that YouTube channel at that AKA link. All right. So just a brief, what we specifically focus on, when we say something like we're all about edge and intelligent edge, it could be a bazillion different things. At an ultra high level, from Microsoft's approach and specifically a Microsoft Azure approach, we look at edge from the specifics all the way down to things like Azure Sphere, which is basically embedded chips from a security perspective that we have IoT manufacturers that can embed in their devices. You can also talk about things like HoloLens and what we're doing with drones, etc. This call, and in particular my team and our focus, and what we'll talk about mostly on these types of calls are really two things, and that's Azure Data Box Edge, as well as Azure Stack. So in previous calls, in fact, the last one we had was a wonderful segment. If you missed it, go check out the recording. Basically, I was honored to have and participate in a POC with one of our great CSAs, Marvin Garcia, where we did a POC based on DataBox Edge and an AI inferencing solution to solve a real-world factory problem. So it's very interesting stuff. We got a recording, but we also talk about Azure Stack, and really from a specifics of a solution perspective, that's where we spend most of our time. If you look at it from what Microsoft has today, some of you may have seen this slide before. If not, it's a pretty good primer of what our specific and tactical solutions look like today, whether we're talking about what we're doing in microcontrollers and IoT devices, how we work with vendors on various edge devices. But again, this part in the middle, like my slick animation there, is essentially where a lot of the real interesting things, at least in my opinion, are happening and what my team are chartered with focusing on, and that is incorporating where needed things like edge appliances like our Azure Data Box Edge solution and what Matt will be talking about today in his configurator, this thing called Azure Stack. And it's all about bringing the Azure platform and the benefits Azure platform can bring from a public cloud region, but bringing that down to where it's needed to solve physics problems, data gravity problems, maybe sovereignty problems in certain areas of the world or country or what have you that dictate that, public cloud is great, but you can't do that here because of certain, again, physics rules or laws of country. So that's what this call's about. That's where we're at. And with that, I've got 11:08 on my clock, and I'm going to hand it over to Matt to steal my screen share and have him take it away.
Thank you, sir. With a title like that, you should really be marketing focused, I think.
You like my
spectacular?
It's like a novel.
Yeah, that's right. So volume 1, right? So let me share my screen. Where are we here? Let me know when you can see it. Hopefully you can. It should just be a pretty empty desktop or with a few icons.
I can see it, Matt.
Good. Okay, so as Kevin's introduced the session as saving precious time configuring your ASDK with the ASDK configurator. Essentially, before we get into the actual configurator tool itself and the pain that I've gone through to build it and what it provides, it's important to understand just what the ASDK is for those that don't know. So when Kevin was flashing up the slides before around our spectrum of offerings in the edge space, from IoT Hub and devices right through to the more powerhouse of Azure Stack itself up to Azure Cloud, the ASDK is a way for organizations, individuals, enthusiasts, developers to experience an Azure Stack system without the requirement of procuring what we would refer to as an integrated system or a multi-node system, which is something that's typically only purchasable or can be acquired from an OEM through a POC. But there's significant requirements associated with obtaining a multi-node system, whereas actually to run a development kit, the ASDK, the requirements are much lower and you can actually run it on existing hardware. So for those that aren't familiar, the ASDK, you can download it. It's like a 10 gig or so download, maybe slightly bigger. It's free. Yeah, you have to register, but once you've registered, you've got the downloader, so you don't have to register again for subsequent builds. And you download it, and assuming you meet the hardware requirements, my configurator can't help you with that, unfortunately. Assuming you meet those hardware requirements, you essentially deploy this Azure Stack development kit. In about 5 or 6 hours, you have an Azure Stack system in your environment, and it actually runs a single physical server with a number of VMs deployed. Now I've highlighted on my screen, which hopefully will keep up with my voice and sharing here. I've highlighted a number of VMs that are there by default when the installation finishes. So you don't need to really worry about these. These would be all hidden away in a proper Azure Stack deployment, an integrated system or a multi-node. These would all be hidden behind the covers. There'd be multiple VMs for each particular role you see here, whereas on the development kit, resiliency, redundancy, and scale isn't really the goal. So you just see one of most things: one domain controller, one network controller, one gateway, one resource provider controller, one privileged endpoint VM. The point being here that when the deployment finishes, there's 13, I think, VMs that are deployed. These additional ones with GUIDs here, I haven't chosen those names. Those are things that my script will actually deploy for you, and that will make more sense later on. But once you've deployed the ASDK, what have you got? What can you actually do with it? And the reality is, not a great deal. And I mean that in the nicest sense, because it's a default configuration just doesn't have anything in it. It doesn't have any images for you to deploy, so you can't actually deploy any VMs unless you've got any images. You need to add stuff. It's not registered to Azure, to an Azure subscription, meaning you can't synchronize down items from the marketplace. It's not got any of the database resource providers or database hosts. It's not got any of the app services. So yeah, you can probably deploy a key vault and create some offers and plans within the Azure Stack, but beyond that, you can't really get anything going. And that's by design. It's designed for you to add those additional services as you need them and really tailor it from the point of the deployment completed. And that's no different from a multi-node system. When you deliver when an OEM delivers a multi-node system into your environment, whether it's for a POC or production, it's vanilla. It's the same kind of state as the Azure Stack development kit. You need to still add stuff to it in order to actually get something from it. So how do you get something from the Azure Stack development kit once it's deployed? Well, those of you who can see my tabs across the top here will see, firstly, you're going to go ahead and you're going to install PowerShell. You're going to do run a load of small and short scripts that will take a few minutes to run to install PowerShell, typically on the Azure Stack Development Kit host, so the single physical server that you're running this on, in order to then control through PowerShell the Azure Stack system itself, the ASDK. Once you've done that, you'll install the GitHub tools that provide some additional administrative functionality on top of the core PowerShell modules that I just described. And then you're still at a point where you can't actually do anything with the system. You've just got more ways of integrating with it at that point. So we need to start actually doing stuff. And the best place to start is registering the Azure Stack, the ASDK. You register it in order to unlock things like marketplace syndication. And on a multi-node, you register it for the purpose of billing. But on an ASDK, you don't need to worry about that. All usage is kind of wiped clean. You don't actually get charged for any usage on the ASDK. So key thing here is you register it, and that unlocks for the importance of the ASDK. Really, it's just about unlocking things like marketplace syndication. But there's another script to run. You have to make sure you've got all your things in order, all your correct credentials and parameters, and you run that, and that'll take another 10 minutes. So you're waiting for that. Then you'll go and download some marketplace items, and at a bare minimum, for installation of the additional resource providers such as SQL Server, MySQL, and the app service, you're going to need at least Windows Server Core, 127 gig, 2016. You're going to need Windows Server Full, more than likely for a file server for the app service, 127 gig, 2016. You're going to need a SQL Server. So you're probably going to download that marketplace image that's Windows plus SQL Server, 127 gig. So my point here is that you can do it. It's easy, and it's easy to follow the documentation. Click on a search, click on a name, download, and there's a few other little bits you'd need, a few extensions you might need for certain workloads. But ultimately, you'll get to the stage where you're waiting for potentially 300 plus gigabytes to download. Now, on the best of connections, can still take a while, but that's up to you. You can do that. Then once you've done that, you can start to deploy the SQL Server resource provider if you want to deploy SQL databases, the MySQL resource provider if you want to provide MySQL databases. In addition to the resource provider itself, you're also going to have to add hosting servers, which are database servers running either SQL or MySQL that you integrate into the resource provider, so that you can then provide databases to your users in a self-service manner. Then you can move on to the app service if you want that. And it explains the things you need to download, the certificates it's going to generate for you if you're running on an ASDK. It's going to walk you through the necessary app service prerequisites you're going to have to create, such as a file server somewhere and a SQL server somewhere, and how you can prepare that easily. I say easily in the looser sense, how you can prepare that. You're going to have to create some Azure AD if you are using Azure AD. Create a service principal or an app in Azure AD, or if you're using ADFS for your deployment of your Azure Stack Development Kit, you can do the equivalent with ADFS. And then, and only then, once you've done that, there's a bit of time obviously taken to read and do all of that. And then you've got the resource provider itself, which can take anywhere from 60 to 90 to 120 minutes. So you've got to wait for that to finish. That in itself is tiring, just listening to me talk about those kind of things to do. And it's fine. It's something that's worth going through at least once to understand what the processes are, and they're slightly different depending on SQL or the databases versus app service. But that's where my ASDK configurator, or the artist formerly known as the ASD configurator, comes in. So if you go to my GitHub, which is github.com/mattmcspirit/Azure Stack, you'll find the newly rebranded in the latest release Azure Stack POC configurator. Very specific, it's designed for POCs to simplify the configuration of all of that stuff and more that I just talked about on your ASDK host, really aiming to save you time. Everything that I just walked through in those tabs can take a day. If you're kind of doing other things, you go back to it, you read a bit more documentation, you download something, you trigger another script to run, you go away, you go and do something else, and you come back. That's a lot of time, a lot of effort. My script simplifies all of that. The key thing to remember, and the reason I call this out, is because it's happened multiple times, and people have contacted me and said, your script's not working. Why is it not working? And I've had that a lot of times, actually. But specifically, it's happened a couple of times where people haven't even actually deployed the ASDK to start with. So they assume that my script will do that for you as well. The script does not deploy the ASDK itself, that needs to be done by you, following the documentation that's available over here in the docs and how you deploy that. But once you have finished your deployment of the ASDK, that's when you would download and run my script. So what is it going to do? Well, it's going to do a lot of the stuff that I just described in those tabs, but in addition to that, it's going to do little things that I found over time, over the last 12, 18 months, are very, very useful. So things like disabling Windows updates on the infrastructure VM, so things aren't randomly updated, in particular the host itself, and it avoids you the temptation to apply patches, because you should leave your ASDK host unpatched as it is when you get that VHDX file to deploy. Don't be tempted to install the latest cumulative update and reboot things. There's no guarantee it will work. Again, not related to my script, just in general. It makes sure that you've got all of your passwords for VMs are correct, all the input parameters are correct. It will register the Azure Stack system, the ASDK, to Azure for you. Rather than trigger a set of downloads from the marketplace, which, as I said before, you need at least Windows Server 2016 core, full. If you want to add 2019, that's another set of 127 gig images. You could be downloading 500-600 gigabytes of images there. And that's going to take a lot of time depending on some people's environments. So I took the approach of, instead, rather than relying on the connectivity and the downloads, just provide me an ISO. Give me an ISO of 2016 and optionally a 2019 ISO of Windows Server, and I will build the images for you. I will build the images. I will download and inject the latest servicing stack updates and cumulative updates to those images, so that you know when those systems land on your network, when you deploy VMs from those images later, you've got the latest updates, because some of our builds that have been historically in the marketplace have been a little bit older. Recently, they've been updated, which is great, but for a period of time, they were quite old, which means when you deploy an image in the Azure Stack environment, it's perhaps 6 months out of date. That's not a good place to be. So hence, my script will actually build images for you and inject those updates. So when they land on your system, when they actually get deployed for workloads, they're patched and up to date for the most part. It'll create an Ubuntu image directly from Ubuntu's cloud images. It'll create gallery items for MySQL 5.7, 8, 2017. It'll pull down VM extensions for popular Microsoft stuff, custom script extensions, and so on. It will deploy the database resource providers, deploy hosting servers to host your databases for your users and connect them to the resource providers, generate SKUs, generate quotas. It will deploy all of the app services in a silent manner, which is pretty neat. It's very, very streamlined. It will create a load of, or not a load, a few plans and offers and subscriptions for your users, so that, again, you don't have to worry about that at a later point. As I said, though, it is worth going through this at least once manually to just understand all of the steps, but in the future then just use the script and it will do it for you. And on your ASDK host, it will install a load of useful tools as well, like PuTTY, Visual Studio Code, and some other Python tools as well, which is useful for Azure CLI, and it will install Azure CLI as well. You can skip some stuff, so if you don't need to use MySQL, skip it. If you don't need to use SQL, skip it. If you don't want the app service, skip it. You can choose to skip those, and it will miss those out as desired. And then what I found more recently is, or in the last couple of months, if you do have slightly older hardware that you're running the Azure Stack development kit, or sorry, the Azure Stack POC configurator on, and the ASDK itself, like if you've got no SSDs, for instance, things tend to chug a little bit more on a non-SSD based system, or at least one that doesn't have any SSDs. So I included this little serial mode flag that basically staggers the deployment a little bit more, because a lot of the power of my script is in parallel. So it does a lot of those tasks that you would normally do manually, individually. It does them all, many of them in parallel, where it's safe and appropriate, which means it finishes a lot quicker. If you don't want to do that because your hardware is a little bit older and it can't handle lots of VMs being deployed at the same time, then the serial mode is handy from that perspective. So what's new in 1907 onwards, the Azure Stack POC configurator, and that's one of the reasons why I changed the name from ASDK configurator, is going to support multi-node. And I say going to because I'm still testing it, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it will support it, and I'll explain that in a minute. So what kind of things do you have to be aware of? Well, when you're going to run the system, and I would definitely recommend reading the documentation, the ASDK configurator doesn't need to be, or the Azure Stack development kit itself doesn't need to be connected to the internet. So my script does support offline mode. So if you had a completely air-gapped ASDK, you can follow the links to my documentation. There's actually a separate script I've written to download all of the prerequisites I need, and it will then deploy it offline. So that works fine as well. So even if you don't have an internet connected ASDK, you can use this as well. So in terms of some guidance, I've opened it in. You essentially, firstly, you would download the script on your ASDK host. So it would sit in a folder somewhere. I just use C drive AZS POC. That's easy enough. Download it, and then you would go into, again, reading the docs, and my usage examples here that I want to illustrate. This first one basically says, okay, there's a script. What's your active, and this is an Azure AD deployment. So what's your AAD directory, where you want to store stuff? So this folder needs to exist. Give me a path to an ISO file, 2019, 2016, both. What's your password on your host system? Now these are sample values. Obviously, I don't tend to use these very secure passwords. What's your AAD username, password? If you don't want to enter the password in plain text here, just leave it out. Just remove it, and it will prompt you. And it will prompt you to gather it as a secure string. So if you're not comfortable with popping it in this view here, because maybe somebody's looking over your shoulder like Kevin, don't worry. You just delete that, and then it will ask you to enter it at the appropriate point when you run the script. If you want to register your Azure Stack system, you choose this register AZS. And if you want to use the same credentials you're using here, the same Azure AD creds, you would just use this Azure creds for registration. Alternatively, if you want to use different credentials, you would supply those separately here. Azure Reg username, Azure Reg password, Azure Reg subscription. Just a high level, the documentation explains all of this. If you have an issue when you're running the ASDK configurator, and it says, okay, this has happened, rerun it and see if it happens again. And then if it doesn't fix itself, raise an issue on GitHub, and I will respond to it as quickly as possible. I don't have an SLA, but I will respond to it as quickly as possible. So what do you get when you finish? Well, in our dashboard on our Azure Stack system, you look at resource groups here. There's a load of things for the file server for the app service infrastructure itself, the database backend for the app service, the registration information, the database hosts, some subscriptions and plans and offers. All of that gets created and defined. A few VMs get deployed, not many. So some to support the app services, the MySQL resource provider, the SQL resource provider, and one of the app service controllers. So it's doing all of that for you, and it does deploy some stuff into the tenant space as well. If we look here, so some of the database servers live in the tenant space, so the MySQL host and the SQL host virtual machines that actually host the databases for your users. That gets deployed into the tenant space because that's where it's supposed to live in a production world. So I thought, well, let's do that for the ASDK as well. So the key thing here is it automates all of that. It automates the connection registration to the marketplace and downloads a load of things automatically for you, of which you can then go and add stuff extra if you want at a later point. So finally, the last thing I wanted to wrap up on and talk about the future was around that multi-node. So if I go to deployment here, multi-node, you'll see I'm very explicit. Don't use it yet. If you're tempted, don't. What's it designed for? Well, not for production. Use it for a POC. If you're having a POC, if you're a customer yourself and you want to do a POC, if you're working with a customer and you want to quickly stand up some of these additional services, use it for that. Don't use it for getting ready for production. That's not what it's aiming for. So very explicit about that. But it does all of the similar things to what we saw in the single node, minus a few things that don't apply because it's not an ASDK host. So something to bear in mind. But generally, it's pretty similar. If we look at the deployments, there's a few extra things to add on. So most of it is the same. But then when you get to this lines 5 and 6, I've added this multi-node flag to tell me it's a multi-node. You need to provide an internal domain, which is something you'll get from your deployment information, your JSON file, the privileged endpoint IP and password, and then a path to some certificates, because on a multi-node system, you're not using the self-signed generated certs like an ASDK. So I need to have that information. And then obviously you're using a custom suffix for your like portal.west.contoso.com or admin portal or whatever. So I need to know that as well. But that's pretty much it. You run it. So far, I've run it once. I've had one success, although it needed a little bit of tinkering and tweaking to get it to finish, but that's all part of the development process. But very soon, I'll be making that available, and I'll be removing the kind of recommendation to experimental only. It may never affect you. You may just use it for the ASDK, but I want you to know that it's it's coming, and it's going to be very useful for streamlining and accelerating the deployment on multi-node systems. So lots of docs there. You've got the link to my GitHub. It's just github.com/mattmcspirit/Azure Stack, and you'll find everything you need there. And obviously, I'm available if you do need questions, or if you have questions and you need them answering. So, yeah, Kevin, that's a whistle-stop tour of the ASDK configurator. Hopefully, that's useful.
Excellent, Matt. Good stuff. Yeah, so I more and more I'm seeing, at least in from an Azure Stack perspective. Sure, people still use that ASDK, but we're seeing more and more kind of like loaner or even POCs where they're piloting on maybe a minimal scale unit. And so being able to, because the one thing I dread, to be honest, is having to walk in and say, oh, so you guys want to do the app service and the resource providers now? Oh, and it's a multi-node. Well, that's a lot of not interactive manual work spread over several hours. So that's no fun.
Not anymore.
Awesome.
But yeah, cool.
Awesome. So thanks, Matt. So that's all we had today. What I've done in past calls, I'm going to hang out here for at least several minutes if you guys have questions or want to ask myself, and I can't promise I probably won't have all the answers. I have a few maybe, but I will try to take care of you as best I can. Next call every other Friday is our cadence, and so the next every other Friday would be on the 30th. So I am working on nailing down a topic as we speak. So like last call is probably in the next week or so. I will post on the topics site and GitHub just the one-liner to kind of give you a heads up about what that topic's going to focus on. So with that, I think we may have be able to give you exactly 1 minute back of your Friday. So I've got 11:29 Central on my clock. With that, I'll go ahead and release you to your day and the weekend. Thanks everybody for joining.